Like,
Now recording.
was it?
Wow.
I don't know what that was. That was amazing.
That was the Discord bot starting to record. That was fantastic.
Oh, Craig, you gem.
Oh, I think I might have to leave this bit in. This will be the little cold open before I play some music and do an intro.
Yeah, I bet you that will take everybody you do this with by surprise. Yeah.
Shall I hop into weird artificial introduction to a podcast mode then?
Yeah, sure.
This is going to be weird. Hello and welcome to this podcast that we don't yet have a name for, but will probably be called Wretched Cast because I'm entirely unimaginative. My name is Chris Bissett, I am the creator of The Wretched, and I'm here today with... In fact, I'll let you introduce yourself. Why don't you tell everyone who you are, what pronouns you use, and what you're all about?
Sure, yeah. My name's Matt, or Matt Sanders. I'm a writer from the northwest of England. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm here today specifically because I wrote and now maintain the SRD, or System Reference Document, for Wretched and Alone games based on The Wretched.
See, there's no way I could have introduced you that succinctly.
Well, I don't know, I thought that was pretty long, but okay.
No, that's pretty good. I don't know why anyone would be listening to this who doesn't know what The Wretched is and doesn't know what Wretched and Alone is. This would be a very strange podcast to stumble upon, I think. But for those who don't know, The Wretched is a solo journaling game played with a Jenga tower and a dice and a deck of cards that I wrote earlier this year. And The Wretched SRD, its Systems Reference Document, is a document that Matt created while writing his own Wretched game, basically to enable yourself to properly understand how the game was working, right?
Yeah, there were parts of the system that appealed to me, and I had a game idea that in kind of on my list already that the mechanics of your game fitted with, and in kind of deconstructing them, I had to make some of my own notes, and that was basically already halfway to a reference document that somebody else would be able to use. Just had to be made appropriately sort of readable for somebody else rather than in my own arcane notes for me.
I don't think either of us quite expected the response we got to it, right?
No, I mean, I guess you didn't expect the response to the game initially that you had, and then we didn't expect that response to the SRD has had either.
Had you known 4 months ago that you were now going to have to maintain this thing for the rest of your life, would you have still made the decision to write the Wretched and Alone SRD?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the surprises that have come with it, the surprise that it's become like a viable thing that people want to use, and I think hopefully will continue to use going forward, has been positive. It's been good for me in terms of writing, in terms of learning how to do things, and it's been good for me like as a business. It's given me more of a profile. It's given me like connections to new people. The outcomes are all good, even if there is work attached to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know for me the SRD was like hugely helpful anyway. Like even though I wrote The Wretched, right, when I came to write Go Alone, I couldn't remember how the game worked. People kept saying to me like, "Oh, I did this with the Kings and I've done this," and I'm sitting there thinking, what's special about the Kings?
What are they talking about?
What are they talking about? I can't tell you that I don't know what I'm talking about because it's my game. So the SRD was really helpful for me actually, and I think it's been really useful for a lot of people. But let's talk about your games, shall we? Yeah, because you've written 2 Wretched and Alone games, and you were the first person to write a game based on The Wretched, hence the SRD happening, the sealed library. This is the game you said that you'd been wanting to write for a long time, right?
Yeah, it was an idea I already had saved up. So when I kind of restarted RPG publishing and sort of created Sealed Library just as a kind of imprint to publish things under rather than my own name, I knew that when I did that, I wanted to have a game or an adventure or a product of some kind about exactly that, a sealed library, like a place where knowledge was kind of sealed away to be unearthed at a later date. And then when you put out The Wretched, that was the kind of catalyst to take that idea into its final form, which was a game about being a librarian trying to save a library. You're like sealed in under siege and trying to save everything you can, but it's important, and you have to make that decision about what's important. And you also know that you can't save everything, or even really a fraction of what you want to save.
So what specifically do you think it was about The Wretched, like as a system and as a game, that you thought fit what you wanted to do with Sealed Library? And that isn't me trying to say, tell me how great my game is.
No, I get it. I think the catalyst, I called it a catalyst earlier, and I think that's the right word. And the catalyst was the idea of being alone in this place. Like, when I'd thought about it before, I'd always focused on the place and the things contained within it. And reading The Wretched, it gave it a lens of focusing on it through the experiences of one person trapped there interacting with that place. And that really made me go, yeah, this isn't about the place or the knowledge within it. It is about one person's interactions with that. And then the idea developed quite rapidly from there, and quite naturally once I had that lens to view it through.
Yeah, what I found writing The Wretched and Go Alone is that especially once you've got the what you want each suit to be, right, the act of actually writing the thing is quite easy.
Yeah, I found that varied between the two games. When I did Sealed Library, it was quite easy. And I think there's a big element there of like genre literacy in telling the story of the Sealed Library. Most of the events that happened in that were things that really I've seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in my other game, that wasn't true. I had to sort of work much harder to think of genre-appropriate things, and much harder to flesh it out, if that makes sense.
So it's interesting you say that, actually, because I read through Sealed Library and Fate Guru in advance of us doing this. And yeah, one thing I've thought when I was reading Sealed Library, your Hearts and Diamonds prompts especially, they're very like, if you were going to write a random roll table of things found in a library or rooms found in a library, you could basically pluck those prompts out of Sealed Library and use them for that, right?
Yeah, they're much. Yeah, those two tables are kind of in line with other products I have written, right?
Yeah, and then when I was looking at Fate Guru, I liked a lot of the things that you reference in your prompts in that game, kind of reference real world things, like the Seven of Hearts is Boris Johnson tackling a kid while playing football.
Yeah, that's what I mean about I had to dig deeper. Like there, I had to really work hard to find examples of real people essentially doing embarrassing or shameful things in public that would feed into the game. I wanted them to be based on real examples, but digging out a good enough variety was actually harder than I thought when I set out to create the game. So
for people who are listening who maybe don't know what Fate Guru Real Vice is, what's your kind of elevator pitch for the game?
Yeah, so there the idea really came from looking at like a kind of American like rich mega preacher or kind of wellness guru who has this kind of totally pristine managed public image that they've spent millions of dollars creating. But underneath it all, they're totally lonely, like riddled with vice and personal problems, and the game is about the cracks beginning to show. The idea that inevitably, if you basically are a shitty person, that will come through and people will see through that illusion you've created.
So one thing that it was quite interesting to look at Sealed Library and Fate Guru side by side, because obviously Sealed Library was the first pre-SRD game that wasn't The Wretched, and we obviously learned a lot from people's response to the SRD and what people were doing. And I think Fate Guru is the first Wretched and Alone game to include safety tools, because I completely overlooked them in The Wretched.
I think was Final Girl before Fate Guru?
Yes, Kat did Final Girl before Fate Guru, didn't she?
Might have been by a day or two.
Yes, you're right.
It was early in the jam, and yeah, you're right. It was definitely one of the first to include safety tools.
And I think we've talked about this a lot. I completely forgot to include safety tools in a solo game, right? And that's on me.
Well, no, I do have a thought about this, because I think ties into something I've already said. I think it's actually harder to get safety tools right in a genre you're very comfortable and familiar with. So when I look at the Sealed Library and it's full of kind of, I guess what you might call like fantasy or medieval tropes I'm totally familiar with, spotting the stuff that might hurt people in those because I'm comfortable with it is harder. Whereas when I was doing Fate Guru and looking at all this other stuff, it was like, well, I can see it in here because I'm really looking at it. I'm actually having to think about it.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah, you're not just kind of painting with a genre brush and not even thinking about what you're doing, just going, oh yeah, this has got some weird shit in it, this has got some books in it, this has got diseases. You just...
Yeah, exactly. So, there's like disease and starvation, for instance, are both things that come up in Sealed Library that actually I'm sure some people would really struggle with. But those, I didn't see that when I wrote it. It was just like, yeah, this is a thing that'll happen. So I think there, it was good for me in terms of writing to step outside of what I normally write and do a different genre.
Yeah.
That helped me realize what safety tools are useful for and how to look for the stuff they need to focus on.
It's really interesting that you say that about genre, because when I read Fate Guru, obviously we do a lot of fantasy and things, and violence is inherent in fantasy, and bodily harm is inherent, and we kind of don't think about it, right? And then I'm reading Fate Guru and I'm reading through your prompts, and I get to the King of Hearts, which is the first king we hit in, if you read them consecutively rather than playing the game. And the juxtaposition of the kind of joviality of the prompts in the hearts and then cracking your skull and bleeding out and dying genuinely kind of took me aback. I got to the king and I read it and I thought, holy shit, that's brutal.
Yeah, I think with that game, I did make a deliberate decision to try and add some levity to it.
Yeah, and you say that in the intro, right? In the safety tools.
Yeah. Yeah, but that wasn't there when I conceived it. Right at the start, it was definitely a darker game, and then I realized, well, hang on, if I kind of go down this dark path, I'm going to include loads of horrific sexual abuse stuff that I don't want to include, and stuff that touches on conspiracy theory. And again, I don't want people to read that and think that I see that as anything real. I don't want to end up as a Pizzagate supporter.
Yeah, totally. You also don't want to kind of push or further any harmful ideas, right? Like, you've got the thing about beetle people, but like if you'd made reference to lizard people, that obviously is wrapped up in a whole load of anti-Semitism and kind of white supremacy and things like that, right?
Yeah, so for instance, beetle people was a deliberate, like, well, okay, you have this kind of conspiracy theory, etc., but it's so dangerous and horrible that I'm happy to reference it, but I don't want to include it in its original form so that people think that's something I am interested in. It's something that, at best, we can make jokes about, and at worst, is a really dangerous thing.
Yeah.
That's why I sort of ended up framing it through the lens of like a trashy gossip rag, right?
Yeah, totally. Like National Enquirer, completely overblown headlines.
Yeah, and I sort of wanted to do that to make the idea of, well, you know, this may or may not be true. It sort of almost doesn't matter. And we should regard it with the same level of kind of ridiculousness that we regard, say, the National Enquirer.
I think you struck a really good tone with it as well. Like, it's the first one that I've read or played that has genuinely made me laugh rather than just feel bad about myself.
Okay, that's interesting, because I think for me, looking back, I think Sealed Library is a better game and a better product.
So what about, can you unpack that a bit? Like, what do you think is the strength that Sealed Library has over Fate Guru? Is it just that you're more familiar with the genre, or is there something else going on there?
I think the prompts are better. I think that in terms of writing a narrative using it, I think what comes out of Sealed Library gives the player a bit more control and is more likely to produce something that's coherent. Whereas I think that playing Fate Guru Real Vice, you are more likely to sort of end up tied in a knot by what the prompts tell you, and it find kind of a difficult path through it where you end up with a contradiction or something like that. And I think there it shows that I was writing more outside my comfort zone. But I think that was better for me as a writer to do so, to push myself to read a bunch of new things.
So I'm now thinking, I'm thinking about the form that the journals take in these games, right? Because it's interesting that you say that about the narrative that's being produced and the fact that the Fate Guru narrative would be inherently quite contradictory.
Necessarily inherent to it, but it could come out contradictory and be hard for the player to kind of marshal that.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking now is that, because I haven't played Fate Guru, I've played Sealed Library, I've only read Fate Guru. But I think maybe if I were to play it now, having heard you say that, what I would do would be to take the journal and write the journal entries as articles from the National Enquirer that I then respond to.
Yeah. So then whether the truth or contradiction in the prompts, it's not part of your lived experience, it's part of the newspaper's kind of alleged experience.
Yeah. Maybe that would give a little more agency to the player to kind of decide what is and isn't true, maybe. Yeah,
actually, I think that's a good point, because in the kind of setup for Fate Guru is that they've found out all your secrets, but I think then the idea that in with that they've embellished and got fake information, and so it's not all true. I think that's actually a good take on it, but I think that's exactly what I mean. I don't think that the Fate Guru is quite such a polished thing, because I was not within my comfort zone so much.
That makes sense. There is definitely a lot of some of it genuinely made me laugh though, reading it, like the prompt about getting drunk at an award ceremony and trying to accept an award that hasn't even been given yet, made me actually laugh out loud.
I mean, I think even if you don't necessarily know, what real world person that is taken from, they are events you can imagine happening, and you insert a kind of character of your own into that imagining, like, automatically.
Yeah. I think you've got some really good moments of humanity in it as well. Like there's the prompt about who taught you to smoke pipe tobacco. Was one that I really liked, because I think that opens it up to seeing the person in this monster that you're creating. I don't know.
Like who they were before they became this kind of fake, like, polished persona, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you wrote the SRD. you released the SRD and we started the Wretched Jam. And I kind of feel bad that I get so much of the credit for that because both of those things were your idea. But obviously the response to the Jam, was massive and surprising and almost overwhelming.
Yeah, it was certainly more than we expected.
Yeah.
And it brought questions and obligations we had not anticipated.
Definitely. Yeah, we've talked about this quite a lot, haven't we? How, especially when you make an overtly political statement like we did in the SRD about how if you're a Nazi or a bigot or a transphobe or anything else, you can go away and not play our games and not make our games, right? Because we had a few incidents where people submitted games to the Jam that we looked at and said,
And they were right on a borderline of where I'm not sure how I feel about it. Like, they were things that if a big company did in their products, I would definitely see as harmful. But when a small indie designer does it, who hasn't got the budget for sensitivity readers and isn't working in a team of people, whilst they are accountable and they should be kind of doing a good job on these things, it is harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I didn't want the Jam to become a thing of conflict, and I didn't want to start telling people what they did or didn't know, especially when these were things that stories that we had no claim to either, right?
Yeah, I think the consideration for me was like minimizing harm. Like, it's less harmful to say to one person, sorry, but this game can't be in the Jam, than it is to have countless people who we probably don't even hear from look at a game in the Jam and say, oh, that's not okay. Yeah, this isn't for me. I'm going to go do something else, right?
Yeah. So I'm not going to call out examples, but I think for me, the primary one, I'll just say it dealt with Japanese culture in a way that I didn't like.
Yes.
And I think that there were potentially a meaningful number of people who would look at the Jam who either are Japanese or have some connection to being Japanese, but they would see that and say, well, I don't really like this. It was more important to take a stance that included them than it was to argue about this one white American's right to tell a Japanese story, I think.
And it's not even like we said, actually, you can't publish that game, you can't use Wretched and Alone logos. We just took it out of the Jam.
Yeah, that's a distinction that I think was important. We didn't say, well, we're telling you to unpublish this. We just said, can you not have this here? Yeah, that's a good point.
So, again, for anyone listening, a lot of these conversations we're having, Matt and I have had in private quite a lot, right? Which is why I wanted Matt to be the first person that we did this podcast with, because we know each other and we can talk to each other about stuff, and we know we have opinions about things. One of the things... Go on.
We've talked about Wretched and Alone games more than me and you. I don't know who they are.
Yeah. If you've talked about Wretched and Alone games more than Matt and I have, please get in touch. I think one of the things that surprised us both and continues to both surprise and, I don't know if frustrate is the right word, baffle, perplex us, is the obsession or the fixation some people have on figuring out A, the probabilities of a Jenga tower, and B, how to model them with dice. And let me first start by saying that I completely appreciate the work people are doing, especially from an accessibility standpoint, because some people aren't capable of playing a game that uses a Jenga tower. They might have manual dexterity issues or anything else, you know? And so having options available for them, for those people to play these games, is great. The fixation on probabilities baffles me.
So I've been thinking about this, and I think it's that there's a fair portion of people who play RPGs or dice-based games because they like probabilities and they love random number generators and the things that they let them do. And they might be thousands of hours of play deep into playing a game where understanding probability and understanding the probabilities built into the mechanics is an important and enjoyable part of play for them. And then they come and they play this thing with a Jenga tower that you designed and I wrote up in the SRD without really accounting for probability, because we didn't view it as numerical probability as an important part of it. The Jenga tower creates something different. But I think I've come to get why people are doing it, because it's something that they are used to, they love it, and it's important in the games they usually play. So I don't think it's actually an unnatural thing at all.
No. It's very interesting to me because it shows me something that I kind of knew but I never had confirmed, which is that everybody looks for something different in games, right? Like I'm not a statist. I can't even say the word. I'm not into statistics. I'm not a mathematician. Numbers hurt my head, and so my focus is on narrative and storytelling and generating emotion and feelings, right? So I come into a game like these kind of games and say, well, the Jenga tower makes me feel this way. And that's all I need to know, because it's not intended to win these games either, right?
Yeah, and the Jenga tower does something that dice do not. It's very, very difficult to simulate that rising probability of failure with dice. The Jenga tower does successfully is it obfuscates exactly how probable it is that you're going to fail. And that's awesome. That feeling of tension comes from knowing failure is more likely, but not knowing exactly how likely.
Yeah. And the one thing, even if you can accurately model the probability, right, the one thing you cannot replicate with dice is that feeling in your gut that lasts for a second as you see the tower wobble and start to fall and know that there is nothing you can do to stop it.
Yeah, or wobble and not fall.
Oh, God.
Or, a Jenga tower has a bunch of those things. Or that feeling when you pull out a block and do a good job and it doesn't even wobble at all.
Yeah. Or that feeling where you pull a block and it doesn't wobble at all, and then you put it on top and the whole thing just collapses under your hand.
Yeah. I think there's more agency in that process than there is in rolling a die.
Yeah.
It's part of what is great about it, but people, they want to know the numbers because they're not used to that.
Yes. So something I've just remembered, and I'm not going to say who this was, but one of the most scathing summaries of these games that we got was, I don't think people are going to enjoy a game where you play a game of Jenga and then you're dead. Or something like that, right?
Yes.
I can't remember what the exact wording was.
No, but they kind of had it's just a game of Jenga with some story prompts and then you lose.
Yes. And I'm thinking about that now. Imagine if you took the Jenga out and it was rolling dice. Surely it's even less satisfying to roll a die and have it say, game over.
Well, I mean, yeah, but look at like the classic, like all the classic choose your own adventure novels,
which I am very into at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. But so many of those have situations as like you roll a die or you choose an option and then you're dead.
Yeah, and even like classic D&D adventures like Tomb of Horrors, famously, you can open a door with no idea what's on the other side of it, and that's it. Your character's dead, right?
Yeah, the same if you bring into play something like a deck of many things, it can just end your game in a really kind of unsatisfying way, I think. So, I think that for that person, and I think for quite a lot of people, it's a game that's very light on systems. If you're not interested in the narrative, you want your RPG to be heavy on G, it isn't for you, perhaps.
Yeah, which is totally fair. So, something that I'm really interested in. Obviously, I've released soundtracks and stuff for The Wretched and for Go Alone, because the Wretched started with me wanting to write a game that felt like a John Carpenter soundtrack, right? So for Sealed Library and for Fake Guru, if you were going to recommend like any other media that maybe would inform or kind of enhance the experience of playing those games, is there anything that comes to mind? Like, is there any music or films or anything that you would recommend people go check out?
That's hard, but that makes it a good question. So I think for the Sealed Library, I think there's a few ways you could approach it. You could look at something genuinely historical. It's if I pretend that the idea of the fire at the Great Library of Alexandria is there's no connection between that and the Sealed Library, I think I'd be lying. So that kind of historical connection about significant historical libraries that have existed and have been lost, that's absolutely a thing you could look at. I think you could look at the library of Babel, I never know how to say that word, as an influence, this idea of an infinite library that contains everything. I think even though there's no direct parallel between that, it's a story worth reading.
That's the Borges story, right?
Yes. And I even think perhaps more left of field, you could go and look at the library in Terry Pratchett, in the Terry Pratchett Discworld novels.
Oh, that's a good call.
Because there you have this kind of labyrinthine, multi-dimensional library and this essentially single librarian who protects it and looks after it. And you could look at that character and think about the lengths they would and do go to protect the library. And that can absolutely inform how you play the Sealed Library through this, slightly more ridiculous take on things. You could absolutely look at something like Terry Pratchett.
If people want like a gaming reference as well, there's the Stygian Library.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good one, but I had not read or was even really aware of that in depth before writing Sealed Library.
Oh, cool.
But you're absolutely right. There's crossovers and parallels there, and that you could absolutely play the Sealed Library as a character in the Stygian Library and as a content generator for the Stygian Library. That would work perfectly.
So there's something we haven't talked about, right? Which I know is one of your favourite things, is the idea of the journal or the artifact that you create while playing Sealed Library then being something that you take into other games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think The Wretched is, in many ways, the prime example of it. If you play the Alien RPG, the contents of somebody's journal from The Wretched are absolutely everything you need to run an adventure. You have this series of logs from someone on an abandoned derelict starship that tells you things about the environment of the starship. They tell you what is broken, what has been fixed. When you enter a room, you can access that part of the log and it tells you about what has happened in that room. And then you automatically, I think, start to imagine the scene that lies before you. The tension that builds through that and the problems you would solve. It's an adventure. Absolutely, those logs could form the basis of an adventure.
Yeah, and so Sealed Library, how often do we play a game where players find an ancient tome full of arcane knowledge, right?
Absolutely.
And being able to physically hand that book to your players at the table would be amazing.
Yeah, and then being able to hand them this diary that then gives them this story, but also tells them what else is in the place they're in. They've entered this vault, hidden in the cellars of this ruined building, where all these fantastic like old books and pieces of literature are preserved. And often as a as the person running the game, you have this question of, well, what the hell is in all these books?
Yeah.
And a playthrough of the sealed library answers all those questions for you in a way that's fun and is actually playing a game as part of your prep.
So that's something you're really passionate about, right? Is that games is the idea of games as subsystems for other games?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that keeps me engaged with RPGs really is like kit bashing things together, is trying out new systems that you're switching in or adding on compared to an old one. And I absolutely think it's a really good space for indie RPG writers to work in, because you can write something that can bolt on to a ton of other games. And that gives you a huge market if only you can reach those people, and gives people who play existing games they're invested in and understand accessible little nuggets of different experience to play through. So when I kind of started publishing again and using Sealed Library as a name, the first thing I published was Have You Heard About the Beast? Which I wanted to be a low or even no prep tool for GMs to run a one-shot or a convention game, or even just hey folks, sorry, I've been really busy this week, can I just throw like a cool side quest at you in the tavern and we'll play through that and then we'll get back to the main thing next week? Because I could relate to that experience of just needing something to run no prep.
Yeah, like a palate cleanser from a big game almost.
Yeah, or just like everybody who runs a game that requires prep can relate to, you've had a busy week and you haven't had time to prep anything or read the thing you were intending to read to play through, but you still want to see your friends and have a fun experience with them. So you need something that's just like, okay, well, this is ready to go. So in Have You Heard About the Beast, essentially you dump a load of post-it notes with questions in a bowl, and then you play out this scene in the tavern where the denizens of the tavern start telling you about this beast that lives nearby, and you take out questions from the bowl, and you take on the role of the NPC in answering that question by telling a rumor about the monster to your party. So, you get what it is, how big it is, where it lives, what it looks like, what it can do, what it guards, etc., etc. And then the idea is that from there, you go off to the place where this thing lives and try and sneak past it to steal its treasure, or kill it, or talk to it, or however you want to approach the problem. And all the rumors you heard in the tavern, all these wild and ridiculous rumors, are all entirely true, and this beast is every bit as fantastic as the people in the tavern told you. And it's supposed to be silly.
Yeah.
It's absolutely supposed to be silly. But I like that. Again, like you talked about a palate cleanser. You just have this fun, silly one-shot encounter, and it's centered on the players. They get to create something. If they've never played RPGs before, it's a great intro. If it's your regular group you play with all the time, it's a nice little palate cleanser.
Yeah, especially the that idea that if you haven't played RPGs, a game like that's a really good introduction, because something like that isn't that far removed from a party game, right? The kind of game where you go to your mum and dad's at Christmas and someone says, "Oh, I'm bringing a board game," and they turn up with Cards Against Humanity.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of post-it notes in a bowl mechanic is straight up from party games, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think we borrow enough from some stuff like that.
No, I agree completely. Again, that's something we've talked about quite a lot, isn't it?
Like bits of paper in a bowl that you write something on is a really powerful zero prep mechanic, and yet somehow it's relegated to the terrible office training icebreaker.
Yeah. And then, like, there are designers in the indie game space, especially, doing really cool things with that mechanic. Like, Oh God, what's it called? Is it Cassini by Nomadic? Yeah, so it's a game available on itch. It's called Cassini by Joey Barranco, who goes as Nomadic on Twitter and itch, Gnomedic. It's a space exploration game, and basically you build your spaceship with slips of paper. You all put stuff in a bowl and you collectively build your spaceship, and then you take it on a voyage, and you physically set your ship on fire as part of the voyage. And that uses that kind of zero prep, slips of paper in a bowl, collaborative building thing that we've all done when we've played, like, what's that, Consequences? That game where you write something on a piece of paper and fold it over and pass it around the room?
Yeah, exactly that. I've just found Cassini.
It's great. It's a really good game.
It's not spelt like... Well, so Cassini's a real spaceship, yeah?
Yes, correct. And it's not spelt like that.
Yeah, it's with ones instead of I's, yeah?
This is one of those moments where I'm going to say, I'll put a link in the show notes, and then, because I've never done this before, I will A, not know how to do show notes, and B, forget.
We've all been there.
I'm sure we have. I'm going to make a little note for myself right now, because it's a really great game. And that does exactly what we were just talking about. It takes kind of very simple party board game mechanics and turns them into something really effective and beautiful, actually.
I love it that it's got warning fire hazard on it.
It's so good. A lot of my favourite indie games use fire, which tells me I need to write a game that uses fire.
So I've got a couple of things involving drawing on the drawing board, I guess you'd call it. But I don't think we've talked about, right?
Okay, yeah, I don't think we have.
So I've been thinking about writing two kind of small one-page games that use the idea of drawing as something to build on. Where, again, like the idea being that literally if somebody in the group knows how to play this game, then you could do it with a piece of paper and a pencil. One of them requires a bit more prep than that, but again, the idea is that you could do it with something found. So one is called This Robot is Broken, and the idea is that you find and repair this robot, whether it's on a spaceship or in a junk shop, on a space station, or like lost in the desert, whatever it is. You find this robot and repair it. And part of it is about the effort and the resources you have to expend in repairing it. And then part of is what you learn from it, the history and the story of this robot. And then the third kind of pillar is what this robot can do and how that affects your life after you have kind of, I guess, resurrected this robot. And again, the idea is that could be a content generator for an RPG or a totally standalone kind of journaling game. And drawing the robot and how you've kind of repaired it is going to be a key part of that. But that's literally like a couple of post-it notes worth of idea. The other is kind of inspired by visiting an auction house and looking at like these old paintings that you see at auctions and in charity shops. And the idea of then taking a painting of an old ship or a painting of a landscape or whatever it is that you find in a charity shop and doing this storytelling exercise where basically you draw or paint on top of it. You add things and tell this story about the place or person in the painting. And then you have this artifact afterward, this painting that you could keep if you wanted to and put on the wall where you've just got this kind of customized bit of thrift shop art that may even be terrible. You may be objectively bad at drawing or painting like I am, but you have got this storied, interesting piece of art to keep.
So you're basically making the game is making a palimpsest over this old piece of art.
Yeah, because I love what The Quiet Year, which I think at this point is an indie RPG classic.
Yes, one of my favorite games.
Yeah, I don't think anybody who knows us and knows it would be surprised to know we both love it.
No.
But I love what that does with drawing and how much it encourages you to draw, even if you just can't draw for beans.
Yeah.
And I would like to do that where you tell a slightly smaller story over the top of something that already exists, this found image, and then you make an artifact, a real world artifact that you keep as a kind of representation of that story.
So, have you played Beak, Feather and Bone?
Oh, I've read Beak, Feather and Bone. I haven't played it.
I think you'd really enjoy that, because the process of drawing onto the map that already exists and filling it in and fleshing it out is really, really fun and really satisfying.
Yeah, it is. You're right. I know. I've read that game, and I agree. And definitely in there is the seed of what I want to do here. It's that idea in Beak, Feather, Bone where you're drawing on the map, combined with. Have you ever heard this idea? Anything can be a monster manual if you try hard enough.
I have.
When I read that idea, I was looking at this like shelf of gardening books at my parents' house and thinking, well, can that be a monster manual? You know, is that really true? Can I make handy gardening hints from 1976 into a monster manual?
That's amazing.
And
the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, but my answer was, well, maybe someone can, but what I can do is take this magazine from the dentist's waiting room or whatever it is, and an image from that, make it into an RPG where you tell a story on top of an image from it as a palimpsest. And that's something I want to make happen.
I love it. I can't wait to see you do that.
Yeah, that's probably going to happen sooner than some other things because they're both going to be just a couple of pages.
Mm-hmm. So, what have you actually got coming up? What's next for you, or what have you got out at the moment that you want to kind of boost?
Well, in theory, what's next is a Kickstarter. What's next is a Kickstarter to finance printing of the things I've already written, and to kind of get that new audience that comes with a Kickstarter. You know, there's definitely tons of people who look at Kickstarter to see what is new, and that's where they spend most of their gaming money.
Yeah, doing Zine Quest was massively valuable for me.
Yeah, in terms of gaining new audience, right?
Yeah.
The other day, I got an email telling me that a friend of mine, who I'm apparently connected somehow with on Kickstarter, backed Gion Shin's game. I didn't even know he liked role-playing games or board games at all. Now, maybe he is really into games, but the point is, he's definitely not like a big RPG person.
Uh-huh.
And he's backed Wait For Me. And he also backed that collection of solo games that's got a hut on the cover. It's on Kickstarter.
I don't think I've seen that. I think I've missed that one.
Okay, yeah, you'd be interested in it. I can't remember the name of it though, but he backed those, and that was a surprise for me. And if he's backing, like, you know, he doesn't know who Gion Shin is, I'm sure of it, but he's seen that game on Kickstarter and backed it. So a Kickstarter is notionally coming, but I keep getting distracted with other things.
Yeah.
So I've got Painting of Old Ships. I've got This Robot Is Broken. I've got a slightly bigger generator than Have You Heard About the Beast for generating like hordes of loot, like a kind of Dragon's Hoard, or through to Aladdin's Cave, through to King's National Treasury Vault kind of thing coming out. That's very player-centered, one-shot, hex crawl friendly.
Yes, I've read that. I haven't played it yet. That's great. When that comes out, if you're listening, pick that up. And
I've got another game called Dead Emperors, which has been written for months. It's just sat waiting for layout, but I convinced myself I should do the Kickstarter first, but maybe that will come out first. And that's one of these game as subsystem things where it's a card-driven storytelling game, basically where you create the stories of dead kings and queens. The idea is that you kind of uncover the inscription on their tomb, and this is what you learn about them. And that's designed to, again, you could play it as a totally standalone thing, but you could play it as a content generator in the moment you enter a tomb in another fantasy RPG. But again, whether I will do the Kickstarter first or focusing on releasing some of those things, I don't know. Cool. And where can people find you if they want to follow along or know more about you? Best place is sealedlibrary.itch.io. That's where they can buy stuff, see games that I've written, and they can follow along there, and they'll just get kind of release updates. They could also follow Sealed Library on Twitter or Instagram, and again, that'll very much just be release focused. If they're interested in me and kind of thoughts about design or other stuff, then I am Matt Sanders on Twitter would be the place to look.
Not crucially, Ian Matt Sanders.
Not Ian Matt Sanders or I'm as a name Matt Sanders. It's I am Matt Sanders, like the existential statement.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me. I'm going to try my best to edit it so that we both sound fantastic.
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
Which brings us to the end of the inaugural Wretched Cast. Thank you very much for listening. Wretched Cast is a production of Loot the Room. To find out more, go to loottheroom.uk. You can find me on Twitter at Pangalactic, or check out my work on itch at loottheroom.itch.io. Thank you very much for listening.